Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time to attend this webinar from C.R.E.A.T.E. I am Ripo. I am currently working as a senior research engineer at Texas A&M University. Before jumping into the webinar, I would like to thank both Stacy and Jeff for hosting me and organizing this webinar. So with this, I will just turn off my video to make the screen more visible. And with that, I think we will go forward from there. Okay, so as we know, the topic for today's webinar is integrated approach for geotechnical and hydrodynamic analysis in a coastal residential built infrastructure, a holistic perspective. So just so to introduce, this is our research team. So we have Hiramani, who is a PhD student at Texas A&M University, and he is actually the guy who is working on most of the stuff that I will be presenting here today. And we have our Professor Dr. Anand Pupala, who is a co-PI and who is also the director for the C.R.E.A.T.E Center at Texas A&M. And the work that we will be showing here is partly funded from one of the other NSF projects that we have been working for over the past 2 years, which is NSF COPE. And hopefully, we are planning to extend this work or some of the understanding from this project to our current project that we are doing as a part of the C.R.E.A.T.E UTC Center. So just to give a quick highlight on what we are going to cover today. So we will have an introduction, a short background on different coastal hazards, that infrastructures, the problems associated with infrastructures, and how we would like to quantify the infrastructure or the damage to the soil in particular and how that affects the infrastructure. And then we will quickly introduce the objective and the research flow of the talk or the work that we have been doing. And then we will show you some results of the problems like this covered around slab on grade foundations. And then we will jump into some new techniques and new topics like more about the statistical understanding of the experimental points, like through design of experiments, and then what we are trying to do with surrogate modeling. And then finally, we will also show some results on some of the ongoing tasks which is going at Texas A&M as a part of both this NSF work as well as the C.R.E.A.T.E UTC. Now, just an introduction. So we, in the part of the US, we have around more than 95,000 of miles in the coastline, which is huge. And along with that, there is more than just let me check the laser pointer. Okay. And more than 40% of the population are staying within the 50 miles corridor, which is significant. And as we all know, recently there is a big changes in the climatic pattern or the ecosystem, and with all the Arctic ice melting, there has been a significant change in the sea level rise. And it is predicted, like on an average, by 2050, there would be a 10 to 12 inches of sea level rise, which is significant, and especially for the coastal communities. Like most of them will be under the sea. So that is a significant cause of concern. Along with that, the frequency of the damaging floods, that is supposed to be increased more than 10 times with the current rate by 2015. And this is a major cause of concern, not for the people in inland directly, but indirectly for sure, but more directly for the people near the coast. Like they are facing forced reallocation, loss of cultural heritage, economic decline, and loss of the blue economy. So these are some significant effects of coastal or sea level rise and changing environment on the coastal economy. Now, just to give some quick highlight of what are the different types of coastal hazards that we are talking, we can see like the one of the major one which we are all familiar are the shoreline erosion, right? So this is like a continuous process, like the shoreline gets eroded away, it reaches near the infrastructures and it damages the infrastructure. So that is a significant concern, and that's a progressive failure. Other than that, there's sudden flood breaches, like because of our infrastructures, if that is not resilient enough, they undergo breach and they damage the infrastructure which is behind that first line of defense. Other than that, there is a changing environmental pattern and this wave attack that caused constant damages to the both near shore as well as the far shore infrastructures near the coast. And finally, like going more towards our civil or the built infrastructure, like the foundations or the buildings or the shallow foundations which are near the coast, they also do face a lot of challenges because of the coastal hazards, both from sea level rise as well as the wave impact. And just to give you an example, like on the right hand side, we see the two major types of damages which can happen to the built infrastructure or the foundations in the coast. One is the erosion and the other is the scour. So in general, erosion is like a large scale phenomena, whereas the scour is more of a kind of localized phenomena, which is more near the piles or the foundation of the footing. And sometimes either one of them causes problem to the infrastructure, or sometimes both of them together, like on the right hand side, both of them can happen together and cause a cumulative damage to the built infrastructure. Now, just moving towards what are the current adaptation measures that has been followed to uh, for preventing the damage of this or overcoming these damages from the sea level rise or any other kind of coastal hazards. The first one is the manage and maintenance. So it is essentially when there is some hazard, there is some emergency procedures which are followed, and through that we either rehabilitate or maintain the damaged infrastructure or make it more resilient. The next one is, this is really important, like whatever the infrastructures that we are trying to build right now, we have to make it more redundant or increase the redundancy. So for that, we have always find some alternate routes or routes for quick mobilization, and then install certain fail-safe infrastructures which will be resilient to the changing climatic or coastal hazards. The third one is definitely the protection. The protection of the existing infrastructure, which is like there is a multiple ways of doing that, but more recently there is more nature and nature inspired solutions. So definitely installing some living shorelines would help us in protecting the current coastal infrastructures, like it can be levees or any kind of foundation systems. And if you have this kind of protection in front of them, they might help in reducing the direct impact from the coastal hazards. Then the fourth one is accommodate, which is nothing but modifying the existing infrastructure. That is like redesigning the infrastructure. So in the bottom, if you see like this is the currently the infrastructure or the built foundation. If we raise the footing or if we raise the foundation, in that case, these structures becomes more resilient to the flood hazard. So this is what we are saying, redesigning the existing infrastructure. And finally, relocation. So this is definitely when the redesigning doesn't work, and then we have to shift the existing community away from the shore. And this is another like way of repurposing the existing infrastructure or like build some new infrastructure away from the shore and prevent the damages to the community in general. Now, what are the typical vulnerable infrastructures that we want to focus in this study? The first one is the residential foundation. The reasons, because like we said more than 40% of the people are staying near the coastline. So that is definitely an interest for the communities. And like any other coastal infrastructures, these residential foundations are vulnerable to storm surges and changing climatic infrastructure. And the next one is the levees. So there are many levees which are near the coast and which do act as a flood protection system. And they do help in reducing the flood risk to the communities away from the coast. But it is also important for us to understand how they would react to this changing climates or the coastal hazards. So on the right-hand side, we see in general what are the traditional infrastructures or the protection systems, like there are breakwaters, jetties, groins, and then these are some of the methods which is mentioned in US Army Corps of Engineers, like how we can protect our coastline. And among them, definitely one of them is the coastal levees. And that's the one where we try to protect the infrastructure, the residential foundations, which is behind these levees from the coastal damages or the sea level rises and sea level hazards. So that's why we are kind of looking into more of a residential foundations for our study, as well as levees for the future studies. Now, just to go towards our research idea, so we just want to talk about a little bit on the types of foundation which is found near the coast. So this is a little very much similar to a traditional foundation which is found inland, but with little bit of difference. So in general, we can classify it in two types of systems. One is the closed foundation system, closed shallow foundations, and the other is the open, deep, and shallow foundation. So if you see on the closed shallow foundation, essentially the idea is there is not much gap between the foundation soil as well as the structure. So this can be multiple types, like there can be a basement type of structure, there can be structure with little crawl space, or some foundation slab which is directly sitting on top of the soil, which is mostly called as slab on grade foundation. So this is one of the things which we are definitely focusing for our study. And the other kind of arrangement is the open foundation system, which is essentially structures which is built on piles or post or columns. So this is like another type of coastal foundation system that is traditionally found everywhere. So, and that can be classified either deep or shallow, depending upon the depth of the pile or the depth of the column. So these are typically the types of foundations that is found near the coast, and our focus is mostly on this slab on grade type of foundation system. Now, once we have understood the types of foundations that we are mostly looking in the coastal ecosystem, let's move into like understanding what are the components like which are involved for our scope, like what are the things which we can essentially look that can damage the coastal foundation system. To begin with, we are looking at mostly the overall foundation system stability and what affects this foundation system stability in the coastal ecosystem. The first one is like more of a kind of parshore structures, like parshore effects like turbulence and wave vortices. The next one is like very much close to the system or the foundation, which is mostly erosion and scour. And finally, which is another principal concern for most of us as geotechnical engineers, is like the geotechnical uncertainty of the soil. We don't know what type of soil is there, and the behavior of the soil can essentially dictate on how the foundation system will behave. So these are some of the major functions which affect the overall foundation stability for the coastal built infrastructure or the different types of foundation systems. Now, a quick background on the levees. So we have essentially more than 40,000 miles of levees in the US. And most of them, and majority, 95, 97% of those levees are the earthen embankments. And very few are like the concrete rock or steel flood walls. And essentially, like the average age of the levees are more than 50 years of now. And most of this data is from the ASC infrastructure report card, which has graded the current infrastructure rating for the levees as grade D. And what those infrastructure card has mentioned, like 4% of the levies, which is only under the US Army Corps portfolio, is risk is unclassified as high or very high risk. So that essentially shows there is a really critical need to understand the infrastructure for the levies as well. And which is more important for us to understand is about 40 to 45% of the people live or work behind these high or very high risk levies. So this is imperative, like we also need to find some understanding on how these coastal infrastructures reacts to the changing hazards in the future. So just some traditional failure mechanisms which is found in the levees. The first one is the external erosion, and then there is the uh, levee breach. So the external erosion is mostly on the seaward side. You can see the eroded slope near the side of the water. And then when there is a flooding event, then there's a breach and the water flows over on top of the levees, and it can cause significant damage on the leeward side or the opposite side of the levees, and which can cause long-term damage to the communities behind it. Other than that, there could be a lot of slope failures, as well as there can be internal erosion or piping, and also there could be some kind of component malfunctions. But out of all of them, levee overtopping and overflow is generally considered one of the most common mode of failure of initiation for any kind of coastal levees. That is why that is also something what we are considering as a part of our study in the future. And just to again, like how the components of the levees behave and what is our concern. So just to give you a typical example, so this is a traditional levee, and we have traditional the seaward slope. In general, these are mostly armored and well protected, so there is very less damage to those kind of slopes. And the next one is the landward or the inward slope. The problem is the flood water is generally, once it overtops from this part or when during the storm surge events or the flooding events, they overtop this levee and start flowing in the opposite side. They create a supercritical velocity on the leeward side or the landward side of the slope. And the supercritical velocity essentially causes lots of damage to the slope. And that essentially erodes away or creates a weak levee, and that can get damaged during the next flood event or even during the receding flood event. So that is what is major cause of concern for this typical levees. And that's why our focus is also sometime on this leeward side or the landward side of the slope, which can be considered as a critical in this case. Now, after discussing like some of the external forces or the infrastructures which is more critical for our study need, let us go and see what are the different forces or the damages which can happen to this infrastructure system. The one that we are concerned is here right now is the storm surge event. So what is storm surge? So according to NOAA, the sudden rise in water level, excluding the tidal fluctuation, yes, without the tidal fluctuations, if there is a sudden rise in the sea level water, or that is known as the storm surge, and that could happen due to multiple reasons. One is because of strong winds and pressure, as well as the local rainfall runoff. And one of the principal effects of this storm surge event is it can cause elevated flood risk to the inland locations. And when there is a flood risk, it is always associated with erosion and scour problems. And this all comes together and results in the damage of the foundations, the levee overtopping, and in general, this increases the flood risk. And therefore, it is really important to understand how this storm surge affects our foundation system. And this is the currently, we have different flood insurance rate maps and special flood hazard area maps, which shows how prone our infrastructures are to the coastal floods. And on the right hand side, we can see a representation from NOAA, what is generally the mean sea level, the storm surges, and the flood levels. So these are some of the major factors or the forces that can potentially cause damage to our infrastructure. And now let's go into what FEMA has it in its guidelines for the built infrastructure, the foundation system. So as you can see, this is like the FEMA P55 guideline for the coastal construction. So essentially, FEMA has divided the coastal regions near the shores into four major zones. The first one is zone 5, then the coastal zone A, coastal A zone, and then zone A with wave height or less than 1.5 feet, and zone X. So essentially, the zone 5 is essentially where the wave height is more than 3 feet and the chances of flooding are really high. And then as we go further away from the shore in zone X, it is very less chances of getting flooded or the limited or the base flooding on the waves. And they have suggested the different types of foundation, which we saw a couple of slides back, the different types of foundation. So for the zone 5, which is mostly open and deep type of foundation system, and it is mostly acceptable. And as we go to the lower or the shallow or the built foundation, it is generally not permitted in zone 5, whereas mostly in zone A, all the type of foundation system is both open, deep, open, shallow, closed, deep, and closed, shallow. Most of these foundation systems are allowed in zone A. So this is mostly based on the idea how prone are those structures to coastal flooding and essentially the damage through scour and erosion. So this is the mostly the foundation or the construction guidelines based on empirical studies or the observations from FEMA. Now, diving more into the technical part, how the erosion is taking place and what is our understanding on the coastal erosion as a part of a geotechnical engineer, and how we can incorporate that into our analysis for stability of the infrastructures, including both foundation or the levees. So to begin with that, what is the condition of the incipient motion? What will initiate the coastal erosion? So the first major thing is condition for the coastal erosion to start. In general, it is not a well-defined boundary, right? Because it is really a large scale phenomena and it is not well defined. And there are different functions which can cause the particles to erode or the materials to move when they are coming in contact with the waves. First one is the function which is the velocity, essentially the velocity of the wave, which causes the particles or the surface to erode, and then the bed shear stresses. Like when the wave or the velocity of the wave comes on top of the surface, they impart some superficial shear stress. And once the shear stress overcomes the resistance from the soil, that causes the erosion. And that is one of the critical functions which essentially guides how the structure or the soil foundation around the system or in the levees will react to the surges or the wave impacts. So in 1936, so that was Shields. So he did a plume test and he developed the dimensional number, which is the dimensional shear stress or tau star, and the Reynolds number, which is R star. So he noted for a critical value, there is for a critical parameter, which is the critical shear stress parameter. If our shear forces, which is coming from our waves, if that value crosses this critical shear stress parameter, then the particles erode. And then that depends upon multiple functions. Like if you see on the bottom, this is the function for the critical shear stress parameter. And one of the major component that he noted was it was dependent on the particle size. So here on the right hand side, we can see which is the particle size. So that is the d star, and it depends upon the unit weight of the soil and the specific gravity. So essentially, the bed shear stress, which is directly coming as a resistance, it depends upon the grain size. So this is one of the major things that Shield showed in 1936. Like, and this on the right hand side, we can see it is a plot of the relation between the Reynolds number and the dimensional shear, because as we know, it depends upon the different particle size. So if our shear stress or the bed shear stress is beyond this critical shear stress, in that case, the particle starts eroding or the particle shifting occurs. And that essentially initiates the beginning of the scour and eventually the erosion. Now, as we see on the right-hand side, like uh, there is a relation between the boundary Reynolds number and the dimensional shear stress, which is essentially the Shields diagram, which tells us, like, depending on the different particle size or the particle diameter, how the critical shear stress would vary and which would cause the particle to move. So taking from this one, we move more towards the geotechnical application, which is how this critical shear stress could be realized for geotechnical perspective, essentially the type of geomaterials. So we have different types of geomaterials, like one can be cohesionless or sandy soil, the other could be cohesive or clay soil. So how we can take this critical shear stress and explain the behavior of both sandy soil or clay soil under this critical flow condition or under this flow boundary conditions. So how to understand the scour in cohesionless soil? This is our first type of soil. So we see on the right hand side is a typical like a schematic of the cohesionless soil, like how three particles are sitting on top of each other, and there is a particle weight, and then there's a frictional resistance coming from the interaction between the surfaces of the two particles with the top particles. And when this particle is sitting in the static condition, this particle weight is balanced by the reaction force from the two surrounding particles. Now, for the cohesionless soil, the resisting force is mostly, like I mentioned, is the particle weight as well as the reaction force, which is the interparticle friction. And the one which causes the particle to move is essentially if a horizontal drag component or a lift force. So those components come from the fluid force. Like if there is a fluid flowing on top of this particle or on top of the surface and hitting this particle, so that will generate a lift component as well as a drag component. And this is essentially the destabilizing force. And this is essentially balanced by the gravitation or the resisting forces. And in case, like the assumption is the scour is a particle by particle phenomena. So it can either be like after the destabilizing force works, so it can either roll or slide. So either there is a rolling movement in the particles, and either there can be a sliding movement of the particles, and that essentially leads to the bed load transport or the movement of the entire soil particles. And finally, there is advected with fluid flow, which is the suspended sediment transport. So the fluid, which is the suspended particle or the materials which is in the fluid, that also flows. So that is known as the advected with the fluid flow. And generally, the scour, like if we look into more the particular level, scour is relatively a quick phenomenon, and the equilibrium scour depth can be achieved within a really like single storm event. So like it is really easy to reach the scour level. Like as I was saying, like erosion is like more of a like a wide scale or large scale phenomena, but in scour, that's a relatively local phenomena, and that can be easily be realized within a single event. And that is why, like many of those models, like they try to like they have been working in the past, and they have tried to establish this scour around this, like scour in different soil or material types based on the laboratory plume test. So this is a schematic of the laboratory plume test, where you have one large plume where you have some materials, and then you force or put some water flow from one end, and it discharges out from the other end. And by the movement of the water, there is some kind of scour or the particle movement within that uh, flume tank, and that is how you measure the scour from the particular soil type and the particular flow velocity. And there are many empirical equations based on that. So a lot of empirical equations which is based on this particle or rolling or sliding friction is based on the empirical understanding through flume test. So this is mostly this is mostly how we understand the phenomena in case of cohesionless soil. Now, moving to the cohesive soil, like our coastal soil can be both cohesionless, cohesive, or it can be mix of cohesionless silty soils. So currently we are only distinguishing between the two major types, the cohesionless and this currently is the cohesive soil. So in case of cohesive soil, like we have an additional component, which is the interparticular cohesion, which is mostly coming from the electromagnetic and electrostatic forces. So the resistance force is generally developed by a couple of things, like essentially the gravitational, because the self-weight of the particle, as well as the interparticular cohesion, which is very micro scale, like electrostatic forces or electromagnetic forces. And again, the driving forces are from the fluid, which is having two components, like we saw in the previous slide, like it has both the lift as well as the drag. And how this forces causes this scour in case of the clay soil, it is again little bit different from the sandy soil. In sandy soil, it is mostly particle by particle, like one particle moves with respect to the other particle. But in clay soil, along with that particle by particle movement, there could be some block movement. A big chunk of materials, because of the cohesion, might move as this block rather than individual particles. So that is known as the block of particle movement. And again, this can be either like both of this movement can either be rolling or sliding, or it can be either they can be mixed or with the fluid around, and they can lead and transport as a suspended sediment transport, or as individually they can slide on the bed and be a bed load transport. And in general, like this phenomena is much slower as compared to pure sandy soils. So, and most of the past literatures have shown us like the equilibrium scour depth is not mostly realized in a single event, because the cohesion essentially prevents the particles to erode, and it's less vulnerable to erosion as compared to the sandy particles. And it's more about getting the scour rate, like the researchers has mostly focused on getting the scour rate rather than the equilibrium scour depth, because reaching the scour depth in a particular storm event is highly unlikely. And therefore, most of the current laboratory setups, including the erosion functional apparatus, EFA, like as seen on the right-hand side, this or ETSDs, they are mostly concerned about getting the laboratory scour rate rather than the equilibrium scour depth. And this is how just they are showing like how they are getting like the EFA apparatus is seen like there is a water and soil material, and you push it through the shell by tube, and there's a water flowing on the horizontal direction, and it erodes the superficial soil, and that is how you measure the rate of scour. And sometimes when you are doing this kind of pipe flow, you might not be replicating the actual scour or the actual flow which is happening in the coast. To remove that error, a modified scoured device, which is ETSD, is there. So these are the rolling belt on top of this pipe, which kind of creates a different kind of shear forces or the forces in that fluid, and that is more closely related to that thing or the erosion happening in the field. So these are some of the devices which are used to obtain the scour rate for different cohesive material. And this is like a different kind of phenomena, like as compared to the cohesionless or the sandy material that we have seen in the previous slide. So, like after understanding this phenomena, let's now go towards more what is our research goal here. So, like after we have understood a little bit on what are the different kinds of infrastructures, what we are looking for as a whole for the coastal or geotechnical built infrastructures, and then the type of forces that we are expecting to cause damage, like the storm surge events or the flood events that can cause damage to our infrastructures like foundations or levees, and then diving deep into the mechanism of how they are directly affecting us as a geotechnical engineers, like how they are affecting the cohesionless and cohesive soil. We now move directly into the research objective and flow, like what we are trying to work here at Texas A&M. So the primary objective of this research is like to develop a computationally effective, efficient model to estimate scour around slab-on-grade foundation. And one important thing is like we are going away from the empirical relation and we are trying to put or understand based on the site-specific flow and soil conditions. So this is our overarching goal or overarching objective for this current study. And to move forward, so the task wise, like how we are moving forward in this study. So the first one is like calibration of the empirical parameters, because our current study is mostly based on some numerical modeling. So we are mostly using flow 3D like a CFD model to understand our behavior. So that's why we first needed to calibrate this model. So we are calibrating our model with respect to the empirical test or some existing plume test. Then after once we have calibrated our model using the experimental results, then we are developing a fully coupled 3D scour model. And this model simulates the scour around the slab on grade foundation. And then using this model, we try to see what is the scour, and then we fix the parameters of maximum interest, which is for us the scour depth. And then also parallelly, we determine which are the key parameters which affect the scour. Essentially, the velocity of the flow, the depth of the flood, the duration, again, the time to which that uh, foundation is subjected to the flow, as well as the particle sizes, or essentially the type of the soil which is surrounding the foundation. Once we have developed this, like we saw like the main problem with running this fully coupled scour model is like it's really time consuming. Like some of the simulations took like more than a week to 12 to 10 days to run. So we thought how to optimize this computation time. So that is where we came up with the idea of using both statistical analysis and emerging technologies like deep learning. So using deep learning, we came up with the idea of developing a surrogate model, which will effectively reduce our computational time and help us solve the challenges from the traditional CFD simulation. So for that, we next went to the design of experiments. So this is the statistical part where we define the input space for simulations, and then we decided on the sampling strategy. So essentially, we used Latin hypercube sampling, and from that, we selected the data points to obtain the maximum scour depths to different random sample points. And once we have those random sample points, we then move towards the development of a surrogate model with these random sample points. And we use different types of machine learning models. So we use deep learning, we use SVR, we use KNN. So we have used different types of modeling and checked what is the best performing surrogate model. So this is the overarching research goal that we are currently following in this study. Just to give you a quick overview of what is the structure that we are working on. So this is the structure on the left-hand side. What we have considered is a slab-on-gate foundation. So this is a traditional slab-on-gate foundation structure, which is having a foundation slab and with the section view and the side view, top view. It is interesting, like we have to create a structure with non-erodible, like our area of interest is only the erodible soil layer. And just for the sake of this CFD modeling, we have to create a structure for the boundary conditions on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, which are the non-erodible layers. And which is again seen on the right-hand side, like this is the one with the conditions, which is the velocity and the pressure conditions, and this is the foundation, and this is again the erodible and non-erodible layer. And then we subjected this foundation to different velocities and flow conditions and the depths, and then we see how much erosion of this cover is happening. And like I was mentioning, like some of these uh, computations are time consuming, like on average, the model runs from 12 hours to sometimes more than a week. And at the end of this simulation, this model generates some erosion profile, which is seen on the right. So this is the erosion profile at the end of that particular simulation. And what we obtain at the end of simulations is something like this. So these are some of the data that we generate at the end of each of those simulations. So which is nothing but we are trying to get the maximum velocity, like at the different times. So we are, all of these are plotted in a temporal zone. So at different time, we are trying to obtain what is the maximum velocity happening on the bed. Like this is the foundation, what is the velocity of the particles around it. And because of those velocity, what is the bed shear stress? Like I mentioned, like as Shield has mentioned, this bed shear stress essentially dictates how the particle will be like behaving or whether it will be scoured or not, or if this shear or the scour of the bed shear stress is less than the critical stress or not. So that's why our idea was to get the bed shear stress, and we can see there is some critical zones of the bed shear stress around the edges rather than at the center. And corresponding to that bed shear stress, this is the scour which is obtained at the corner, like this blue point. So this is the net scour depth, and which was seen like at the end of the simulation, which is approximately 200 minutes. It was near to 0.5 meter. So this particular is like an example, like where we have used our velocity for input as 0.85 meter per second, the D as 0.27 meter, and the time is 216 minutes. So this is one particular sample point that we have used to generate the scour profile. And similar to this, we have generated around 50 such sample points for generating the initial data set for running the statistical sampling. Now going to the statistical sampling and design of experiments. So this is like what we have mentioned, like this is mostly we have used the Latin hypercube sampling. So this Latin hypercube sampling, this is what we are using for selecting the random data points. So the advantage of Latin hypercube sampling is that it kind of takes a strategic approach for sampling by dividing the design space into a number of equal intervals. And this then subsequently randomly selects a unique combination of input parameters. And by doing that, it ensures that the sample points are evenly distributed on the domain. And this criteria is like really helpful, like it is based on the maximizing the distance between the sample points, and that's why we have used this Latin hypercube sampling as a statistical method for doing the random or the design of experiment. And after we have done the Latin hypercube sampling or the selection data points, then we used different machine learning models essentially to develop the surrogate model. Like for example, we have used polynomial regression, support vector regression, KNN regression, Gaussian process regression, and deep neural networks. And we have tried to compare, like after selecting those data points, can those data points give us the effective or the predicting scour depths like the one which we have seen through our computational fluid dynamics model? And these are some of the sample results, like these are like the mean squared error and mean absolute error values. But in general, what we saw, like for both the training and the testing data, the support vector regression performs the best and they give the most predicted scour depth value for the test data similar to the training data. So like if we go to the next slide, here we see like that some of the example of surrogate model, like we can see on the left hand side, this is the training data. And for us, the line of equity. So this is the actual scour depth and the predicted scour depth. So this is a training set. And using training set, we have put a testing set based on that different neural networks understanding and KNN, polynomial, GPR, DNN, SBR. And based on our neural network surrogate model, we saw like currently the SVR model across all metrics performs based on the testing data set. So this is still an ongoing work, but this is like really helping us to reduce the computation time and like predict the scour around the slab on grade foundations. So this is still ongoing work and we are trying to still optimize the model. We are trying to see how deep learning can be used, or in the future, can we introduce a new set of constraint or the boundary layer constraint, or essentially going more towards physics informed neural networks to understand the scour around the slab on grade foundations. So after establishing like which is the best performing surrogate model, we took a step forward using the deep neural network model and tried to see how the parameters or the conditioner or the inputs get affected and how they influence the scour depth, the values which we are obtained from the machine learning or this surrogate models. So for that, we did the monotonicity analysis, like as the next slide. So this is the monotonicity analysis where we had tried to see how the points predicted from the surrogate model affects the scour depth. So what we saw in that one is like the surrogate model is like the scour depth is directly dependent on the D50. So as the D50 increases or the size of the particles increases, the erosion depth gradually decreases. And in general, like there is a, as the depth of the foundation or the soil at which the water is interacting, as that goes down, the erosion kind of increases and then decreases. For the velocity, it's like common understanding, as the velocity increases, the depth of the scour increases. And finally, as the time of the flow, like if the wave or the storm surge or the flood is continuously flowing on top of the erodible material, the depth of the scour gradually increases. But after some time, it of course, it becomes kind of constant because only depth with a particular velocity won't change. You have to either increase the velocity to get much higher scour depth. So these are some of the major conclusions, like what we have seen so far, but we are still working on it. And once we have more results on it, we will be happy to share it with the group. Now, moving over to our some other ongoing studies, essentially now changing our focus from foundations or the slab on grade foundations to levees. Like this is the other critical infrastructure that we have talked about. So what we have seen previously, like the overtopping, like which is one of the most critical function which happens, and that happens because when the water moves over the crest, the velocity, if you can see on the right hand side, the velocity increases near the top of the slope on the opposite side, and that changes the velocity to critical velocity, and that velocity can induce bed shear stress. And because of that bed shear stress, the materials or the particles on the leeward side of the slope can erode. So that is why this is another important thing which we are focusing right now, and we are still working on it. So this is currently the CFD model, and we are trying to see how that erosion can be quantified. And then we are kind of looking into the constant overflow during the crest, during the storm surge events. And then we are trying to do like multiple functions again, like what is the volume of the discharge, what is the velocity of the flow, and what is the time by which the flow will be going over the levees. And after that one, we are trying to move more towards understanding, because of this erosion, how the levee stability will change. So that's where we are trying to understand the probability of the failure of the levees. And for that, we are kind of moving towards more into a fragility curve analysis, where we will try to predict the effect of both velocity and the height of the storm surge on the probability of the failure of the levees. So this is the exciting ongoing works which we are kind of doing as a part of this NSF project, and we are kind of extending it to the project which is a part of the C.R.E.A.T.E Center, and we are looking into the effects of this levee overtopping on these infrastructures from the coastal hazards. And going further, we are not only trying to understand the effects of the levee overtopping on the or the coastal erosion on the levee overtopping and the damage to infrastructure, we are also trying to understand how can we prevent it. So for that, we are kind of looking into multiple mitigation measures. So we are quite familiar with the first one, which is essentially the soil treatment. So like if we have seen previously, like in our previous slides, like the cohesive material are less prone to erosion as compared to the cohesionless material. So soil treatment is one of the major methods which can introduce soil cohesion or the material cohesion. And by that, if we can create a cohesive environment or the cohesive layer in front of the infrastructure, like in front of foundation or levees, that will be more resistant to the bed shear stresses. And in that way, it will be less prone to erosion. So, and at the same time, because of the chemical treatment, it will also improve the strength and it might overall improve the stability of the levees. But one of the major concern is because since there is some chemicals involved, it might not be easy to do those kind of treatments in coastal environment because of the marine ecology that might get damaged because of the chemical treatment. So the other alternative is like more recently there has been a major focus like from both federal and the US Army Corps on the use of nature or nature inspired solutions. So we are also looking into some artificial mangroves or man-made mangroves that can be installed in front of those levees. The idea here is like these mangroves will be placed on top of like a composite mangroves with some strong foundation system. So we are kind of looking into different kind of geosynthetic products like some kind of geocells that will be essentially used to improve the foundation. And then we use mangroves, which will act as a energy absorber. So the waves will hit the mangroves and they will lose their velocity and the energy. And in that process, it will not cause erosion or any kind of scour on the structure behind it. So we are looking into mangroves, we are looking into artificial corals. So these are some of the ongoing things which we are looking into as a part of the C.R.E.A.T.E project that we are doing right now with Texas State. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your time today, and I would really be happy to answer any questions at the end of this webinar. You can also reach out to me on this email, and we have a website where we have more information on this project. And with that, I will stop sharing my slide and thank you again for your time today.